What if one of the oldest Bibles on earth was never lost, just quietly ignored? What if Africa wasn't a chapter added later to sacred history, but the place where some of its deepest pages were never removed? And what if the texts you were told were extra, apocryphal, or too much, were actually saying something the world wasn't ready to hear? Tonight, the story turns toward the Ethiopian Bible, the forbidden chapters preserved in stone, chant, and memory, while empires argued over what counted as truth, a tradition that speaks of watchers and stars, covenants and cosmic order, guarded not by councils, but by people who understood patience as power. This isn't about rewriting faith, it's about widening the lens. Because when Africa re-enters the center of spiritual history, the past looks different, and so does the present. Identity shifts, authority trembles, and the silence around certain texts suddenly makes a lot more sense. So listen closely. If these words feel heavier, older, somehow familiar, there's a reason. And if this kind of hidden history resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments from which part of the world are you listening to this ancestral revelation. Stone dust hangs in the air of the Ethiopian highlands, and time feels thicker there, almost heavy enough to touch. Long before printing presses and councils with polished marble floors, words were already breathing inside caves and carved churches. This wasn't Europe's faith on African soil. It was something older, something stubbornly alive. And yeah, history doesn't always like that kind of independence. Scrolls slept where fire couldn't reach them, wrapped in leather darkened by incense and centuries of prayer. While empires rose, argued, and collapsed over doctrine, these texts stayed put. Funny thing is, the older they were, the quieter the world became about them. Not erased, not destroyed, just politely ignored, as if silence could do the job. The land itself seemed to conspire in their protection. Mountains folded like clenched fists, valleys echoed with chants and ge'ez, and stone churches sank into the earth instead of rising above it. Faith here didn't need towers, it needed memory, and memory, once rooted, doesn't ask for permission to survive. What survived wasn't a single book, but a worldview, one that refused to shrink. A biblical tradition, broader, heavier, carrying chapters others decided were too much. Too cosmic, too inconvenient. And somehow it was Africa that held on to them while the rest of the world trimmed the edges of the sacred. Because once you realize a book wasn't lost, but deliberately sidelined, a bigger question starts whispering. If this survived untouched in Ethiopia, what else has been standing right there, waiting for someone brave enough to look closer? The world outside Ethiopia was still finding its footing when Aksum was already speaking in gold and stone. Coins bore symbols of power, trade routes stretched toward Rome and India, and faith traveled faster than armies. This wasn't a peripheral kingdom watching history happen, it was helping shape it, quietly, confidently, without asking for applause. Christianity didn't arrive here as an echo of Europe. It arrived early, raw, untranslated by empire. Aksum adopted the cross while Rome was still debating it, and did so on African terms. Funny how that part rarely makes it into textbooks. Guess it complicates the idea of who taught whom. Cities hummed with ritual and commerce. Incense burned alongside iron. Prayers rose with the sound of markets, and belief wasn't separated from daily life. Kings ruled, but symbols ruled deeper. Power here wasn't just political. It was cosmic, tied to heaven and earth in the same breath. This was a place where scripture wasn't frozen into doctrine yet. Stories flowed, expanded, absorbed memory and myth. Sacred texts were living things, not closed files. And when words are alive, they don't like being edited by committees centuries later. Because a civilization that early, that connected, that spiritually confident, doesn't just receive a Bible, it preserves one. And the version it protects tends to carry echoes others would rather forget. Within those stone-walled sanctuaries, the sacred didn't arrive thin or abbreviated. It arrived whole, layered, unapologetic. The Ethiopian canon grew not as a rebellion, but as a preservation. 81 books breathing together, refusing to be slimmed down for comfort. While other traditions closed their doors, this one kept listening. Some texts spoke of calendars older than kings, of creation measured in rhythms rather than dates. Others mapped heaven itself, describing cosmic order with unsettling confidence. Not myths whispered in fear, but knowledge, written like memory. And oddly enough, these writings didn't vanish. They were simply labeled extra elsewhere. A polite word for inconvenient. The language mattered. Ge'ez wasn't just ink and sound. It carried layers, meaning, number, vibration. Words weren't symbols pointing at truth. They were truth shaped into form. Read aloud, they weren't merely read. They were activated. Maybe that's why translation felt dangerous to those who preferred control over resonance. Monks guarded these books not as relics, but as responsibilities. Each manuscript copied by hand, each error corrected with fasting and prayer. This wasn't nostalgia. It was continuity. A quiet insistence that sacred knowledge doesn't expire just because someone redraws the borders of belief. And among these preserved writings, one voice stood out. Older, stranger, cosmic in tone. A book that spoke of watchers, stars, and forbidden wisdom. A book quoted, then quietly sidelined. It spoke of a time before silence was enforced, before heaven was simplified. The Book of Enoch didn't ease readers into comfort. It pulled them upward, into skies crowded with beings who watched, taught, and eventually fell. Not demons in the modern sense, but guardians who crossed a line. And once crossed, history never quite recovered. Enoch walked between worlds without armor or crown. He listened where others feared listening. Stars weren't distant lights to him. They were ordered intelligences, moving with purpose. Time bent in his presence. Judgment wasn't just moral, it was cosmic, written into the architecture of creation itself. What made the text unsettling wasn't fantasy, it was precision. Calendars aligned with solstices, descriptions echoed older cosmologies, and knowledge arrived too early for comfort. So early that later traditions borrowed from it quietly, then acted surprised when the source refused to disappear. Ironically, fragments of Enoch survived in caves near the Dead Sea, validated by archaeology centuries later. Funny how something called heretical keeps leaving fingerprints everywhere, almost like truth has a habit of resurfacing when ignored long enough. And while much of the world debated whether Enoch should exist at all, Ethiopia never stopped reading him. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. If this voice was never silenced here, what else was never meant to be? Africa didn't inherit these texts by accident. It guarded them by instinct. While empires argued over doctrine, the highlands became vaults of memory. No grand announcements, no declarations of authority, just preservation through devotion. Sometimes the most radical act is refusing to let go. The irony is sharp if you look closely. As councils across the Mediterranean debated which books felt inspired enough, monks in Ethiopia were already living inside those words. They didn't need permission to recognize sacredness. They recognized resonance. And resonance doesn't ask for consensus. There was no rush to standardize heaven here. Spiritual knowledge remained expansive, layered, even a little uncomfortable. Angels could fall, humans could rise. The cosmos wasn't neat, and faith didn't pretend it was. That complexity stayed intact, even when the outside world preferred simpler answers. The mountains helped. Isolation became protection. Manuscripts hidden in monasteries, caves, and churches carved into rock stayed beyond reach of reformers and conquerors alike. What couldn't be conquered couldn't be edited, which makes you wonder, Was Africa merely preserving old texts or safeguarding a version of spirituality the world wasn't ready to face? Because the deeper this trail goes, the more it starts pointing backward to a lineage older than scripture itself. Long before borders were drawn, a story crossed deserts and seas, one that tied Africa to Jerusalem through blood, not metaphor. The Kebra Nagast speaks of a queen and a king, of wisdom exchanged beneath incense-heavy air. Solomon offered knowledge. Sheba carried something heavier back home. From that union came Menelik, raised between worlds, trained in law and ritual. When he returned to Ethiopia, he didn't come empty-handed. Tradition says the Ark followed him. Not stolen, not seized, but transferred by divine will. Funny how that detail rarely survives retellings elsewhere. The Ark wasn't just a box, it was presence. Covenant made physical. Power that demanded ritual, purity, and fear. In Ethiopia, it wasn't displayed or debated. It was hidden, guarded, and fed by prayer. Some things aren't meant to be proven, they're meant to be protected. Churches formed their architecture around this belief. Every tabot echoed the Ark's form, turning each sanctuary into a microcosm of Sinai. Faith here wasn't symbolic, it was spatial. Heaven had coordinates, and Africa knew them. If the Ark truly rests on African soil, then the axis of sacred history shifts. And once that shift happens, the next question becomes unavoidable. What other foundations of belief were laid far from where we were taught to look? The letters themselves carried weight beyond sound. Ge'ez's script wasn't designed just to be read, it was meant to be felt. Each character held layers, a voice, a number, a direction, a pulse. Reading became an act of alignment, not information. Ink turned into ritual the moment it touched parchment. Chants filled stone corridors with vibration, low and circular, looping back on themselves like time remembering its origin. Incense mixed with breath, myrrh clinging to the air, while syllables opened inner doors. Words weren't symbols pointing outward, they were keys turning inward. This is where irony creeps in quietly. While elsewhere scripture was flattened into doctrine, here it stayed multidimensional. Translation wasn't rushed because meaning wasn't fragile, it was dense. Simplify it too much, and something essential would break. Maybe that's why others preferred it locked away. Monks learned the letters the way astronomers learn stars. Not all at once. Slowly, with discipline. Each mistake corrected through fasting, each success met with silence. Knowledge wasn't owned, it was endured. And when writing itself becomes sacred technology, it changes how truth moves through history. Because if letters can carry spirit, then erasing a text isn't just censorship, it's amputation, which makes the next chapter feel inevitable as outside forces finally came knocking. The rituals never asked to be understood by outsiders. They moved to older rhythms, drums echoing heartbeats, bells cutting through dawn mist, bare feet pressing cold stone before sunrise. Faith unfolded through the body as much as the mind. Fasting carved clarity into flesh. Prayer rewired time. Water, oil, fire, and smoke weren't metaphors here, they were instruments. Baptism meant immersion into memory, not just belief. Oil sealed protection. Fire purified space. And incense wasn't decoration, it was a bridge, lifting intention into the unseen. Nothing was rushed, nothing was casual. Children learned these movements before they learned questions. Elders passed gestures the way others pass names. Each ritual mirrored something older than the church walls, echoes of Nile cosmology, desert covenants, mountain sanctuaries. Funny how continuity looks suspicious when it refuses to break. To an outside eye, it all felt excessive, too physical, too mystical, too African, and that, quietly, became the problem. Because practices rooted this deep can't be easily rewritten without breaking the people who carry them. So when foreign interpretations finally arrived, carrying rules instead of reverence, friction was inevitable. And with it came a slow, deliberate attempt to reshape what could not be owned, setting the stage for a conflict far larger than ritual alone. The pressure didn't arrive with fire at first. It came with correction, with smiles, with the quiet assumption that something ancient needed improvement. European missionaries spoke of alignment, of purification, of true doctrine. Ironic, considering how late they arrived to the story. Texts were examined, compared, and politely questioned. Certain passages felt uncomfortable, too cosmic, too African. Angels behaving badly, humans crossing celestial thresholds. It didn't sit well with systems built on control and hierarchy. So the solution wasn't destruction. It was marginalization. What couldn't be erased was reframed. What couldn't be reframed was ignored. Over time, the narrative shifted just enough for the original to seem strange, even to those who inherited it. That's how distortion works. It whispers until truth starts doubting itself. Yet the Ethiopian tradition resisted cleanly. No councils were summoned to vote heaven into shape. Faith remained practiced, not debated. And because it was lived daily, it couldn't be fully extracted. You can conquer land faster than memory. Still, the damage echoed outward. Global Christianity learned a narrower story, trimmed of its African spine. And once that spine is removed, something essential goes missing, something that only reappears when buried texts begin to surface again. Stone doesn't lie easily. Beneath Ethiopian sun and shadow, archaeology began whispering back, quietly at first. Monasteries yielded manuscripts older than expected. Churches revealed foundations aligned with celestial patterns, and caves preserved texts thought long extinct. Funny how the ground remembers what institutions forget. Then came the Dead Sea Scrolls. Fragments of Enoch, Jubilees, and calendars identical to those preserved in Ethiopia surfaced far from Africa. Scholars paused. Some adjusted footnotes. Others looked away. Because when two distant traditions share the same forbidden knowledge, coincidence stops being a comfortable explanation. The parallels stretched further. Egyptian funerary texts spoke of star journeys and judgment halls. Mesopotamian tablets described watchers descending from heaven. Suddenly, Enoch didn't look isolated. He looked central. Africa wasn't borrowing mythology. It was standing inside the original conversation. Carbon dating confirmed what oral tradition had always claimed. These ideas weren't medieval inventions. They were ancient, structured, and globally echoed. The irony is sharp. The more science verified the timeline, the less eager certain narratives became to engage with it. And so the evidence kept stacking. Texts, stones, symbols, each pointing toward a shared spiritual architecture, one that didn't start where history books usually begin. Which naturally leads to the next discomforting thought. If Africa held this knowledge first, who exactly learned from whom? The pattern didn't stop at parchment and stone. It echoed in people. Across oceans and centuries, fragments of Ethiopian belief resurfaced in unexpected places. Chants bending rhythm in the Caribbean, fasting traditions carried into the Americas, symbols reappearing where no official history said they should. Almost like memory refusing exile. In the African diaspora, spirituality adapted but didn't dissolve. Heaven stayed close. Ancestors stayed present. The idea that the sacred could be guarded by a people, not an institution, survived displacement. Funny how what was dismissed as folklore kept producing resilience where doctrine often failed. Politically, this silence mattered. A narrative that centers Africa as origin disrupts hierarchies built on inheritance and control. If faith didn't flow one way, then authority never belonged to one place. And that idea, quietly, scared those who benefited from linear histories. Spiritually, something began to stir again. Scholars, artists, and seekers turned back toward Ethiopia, not for novelty but for grounding. The Bible felt heavier there, less edited, less afraid of mystery. And mystery, after all, is where faith either deepens or collapses. Because once people start sensing that something vital was withheld, not lost, the search intensifies. And the next question presses harder. If this knowledge endured colonization and silence, what role is it meant to play now? In the present, the ancient doesn't announce itself loudly. It hums. In Ethiopia, prayers still rise before sunrise, voices cracking the dark with rhythms older than nations. What was once dismissed as peripheral now feels uncomfortably central, as if time itself is circling back to unfinished business. Globally, faith is restless. Institutions struggle. Certainty thins, and people search for something that feels rooted instead of rehearsed. And here's the irony: answers begin surfacing from the very places history told them not to look. Texts once sidelined now feel strangely relevant, speaking of cycles, accountability, and cosmic order. The Ethiopian tradition doesn't rush to correct anyone, it simply remains. There's power in that kind of patience. While modern spirituality fractures into trends, this lineage stands intact, carrying a Bible that never agreed to be reduced. Not louder, just deeper. Identity shifts when origin stories change. For Africans in the diaspora, reclaiming this legacy isn't about replacing one belief with another. It's about restoring scale, understanding that Africa wasn't a footnote in sacred history, but a foundation. And when foundations reappear, structures above them start to tremble, which leaves one final tension hanging in the air. If this knowledge has endured intact for so long, maybe it was never meant to end here, but to awaken something still unfinished. Silence, after all, was never emptiness, it was strategy. For centuries, the Ethiopian tradition chose restraint over proclamation. No campaigns, no manifestos, just continuity. While the world chased progress, these teachings waited, knowing cycles always return what they try to outrun. There's an old understanding here: revelation ripens. Released too early, it's rejected. Released too late, it's misunderstood. So knowledge stayed cloaked, moving through chant, ritual, and lineage rather than ink alone. That patience wasn't weakness. It was timing. Ironically, modern technology did what conquest couldn't. Digital archives, satellite imagery, and global scholarship began exposing what isolation once protected. Manuscripts surfaced online. Lalibela appeared from the sky like a carved prophecy. The hidden was suddenly visible, whether the world was ready or not. And readiness is the real test. Because once you see Africa not as a receiver but as a keeper, something breaks open. The idea of spiritual hierarchy collapses, linear history stutters, and people start asking questions institutions never prepared answers for, which leads straight into a deeper unease. If truth was intentionally preserved in silence, what happens now that the silence is lifting? Because revelation rarely arrives without consequence. What emerges next isn't outrage, it's responsibility. When ancient knowledge resurfaces, it doesn't demand belief, it demands posture. In Ethiopia, scripture was never about domination or expansion. It was about balance between heaven and earth, memory and restraint. That balance feels almost radical now. Modern readers approach these texts hungry, sometimes reckless, wanting answers without preparation. But the tradition moves slower. It reminds that wisdom isn't consumed, it's carried, and carrying something sacred reshapes the one who holds it. That's a truth modern culture isn't always comfortable with. There's irony in watching institutions scramble to contextualize what was once dismissed. Academic debates flare up. Documentaries soften the edges, footnotes multiply. Yet the core remains untouched. These writings were never meant to fit neatly inside systems built on certainty. Spiritually, the ripple is subtle but deep. people begin sensing continuity instead of rupture. Faith stops feeling imported. Identity stops feeling borrowed. And Africa re-enters the story not as a correction, but as an origin remembered, which leaves the tension unresolved, exactly where it belongs. Because once knowledge starts reshaping identity, the final question isn't what these texts say, but who we become now that we've heard them again. Night settles differently in the highlands. It doesn't rush, it listens. Stars feel closer there, almost attentive, as if they remember being named once. The same stars Enoch mapped, the same order etched into calendars long before modern clocks tried to tame time. Astronomy here was never separate from spirit. Seasons weren't just weather, they were messages. Solstices aligned prayer, fasting followed celestial cycles, and the sky functioned like scripture written in light. Funny how science later discovered patterns people were already living by. This knowledge didn't travel as theory, it traveled as rhythm. When to plant, when to wait, when to speak, when to stay silent. The heavens weren't distant, they were participatory, woven into daily survival and spiritual discipline. Western tradition eventually stripped the sky of voice, turning stars into objects instead of witnesses. But in Ethiopia, they remained part of the covenant. Look up long enough, and the old order still whispers, unchanged, unimpressed by modern disbelief. And if the cosmos itself was part of this sacred architecture, then the story widens again. Because a faith aligned with the stars doesn't belong to one people alone. It points towards something humanity once shared, and may be circling back to remember. Memory doesn't fade evenly. Some truths sink deeper when pressed down. Across generations, Ethiopian elders understood this instinctively. Knowledge survives best when woven into life, not displayed for approval. Stories were sung, not argued, lived, not defended. Colonial narratives tried to flatten this complexity, reducing spirituality to dates and dogma. But the deeper layers stayed intact, protected by rhythm and repetition. You can rewrite textbooks. You can't rewrite what people breathe into their children at dawn. There's a quiet irony here. What was dismissed as isolation was actually insulation. While the world standardized belief, Ethiopia preserved variation. While others chased universality, this tradition safeguarded specificity. And specificity, it turns out, is where truth hides best. Today, scholars arrive with scanners and questions, but they're always a step behind the lived memory. Manuscripts confirm what chance already knew. Carbon dates catch up to oral timelines. Science nods slowly, reluctantly, to what faith never doubted. And as recognition grows, another tension forms, because once memory is validated, it demands response. Not applause, not correction, but reckoning. And reckoning always opens the door to the final stretch of revelation still waiting ahead. Power shifts quietly when origins are reclaimed, not with declarations, but with perspective. Once Africa is seen as a keeper of sacred continuity, modern hierarchies start to feel fragile. Authority based on who came first suddenly has to renegotiate its footing. This is why the story was never just spiritual, it was political, even when no one said it out loud. Control over scripture meant control over meaning, and control over meaning shaped empires. Funny how a wider Bible complicates the idea of centralized truth. For the diaspora, this realization lands deep. Faith stops feeling inherited through trauma and starts feeling ancestral again. The sacred becomes something remembered, not imposed. Identity, once fragmented, begins stitching itself back together through story. In the modern world, that stitching shows up everywhere. Music, art, scholarship, even quiet personal rituals no algorithm can track. People aren't converting, they're reconnecting. And reconnection doesn't need permission slips from history. Because once a foundation is felt rather than argued, it changes how the future is approached. And that raises a final unsettling momentum. If Africa's spiritual legacy was never erased, only delayed, then what role is it about to play next? What remains now isn't secrecy, but choice. The knowledge has survived fire, distance, and distortion. It's no longer hidden in caves alone. It's visible, searchable, quietly unsettling. And that changes the dynamic. Because once something is seen, it can't be unseen. The Ethiopian tradition never rushed this moment. It understands that revelation tests maturity. Not everyone who finds ancient truth knows what to do with it. Some turn it into spectacle, others into argument. Very few let it reshape how they listen, how they live. There's a subtle warning embedded in these texts. Knowledge without humility collapses into noise. Power without balance corrodes. The watchers fell, not because they descended, but because they forgot restraint. Funny how that lesson keeps repeating itself century after century. So the legacy doesn't demand agreement. It demands awareness, a pause, a recalibration of where authority, faith, and origin truly sit. Africa's role here isn't to dominate the narrative, but to remind the world that it never owned it. And with that reminder hanging in the air, the story leans forward, not backward. Because what's been remembered now asks something of the present. And whatever answers come next will shape the chapters still unwritten. The night closes the way it always has in the Highlands, slow, reverent, unfinished. What was revealed was never meant to end cleanly. Ancient knowledge rarely does. It lingers, like incense in stone corridors, like echoes that refuse to settle. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't close a story. It reopens one the world tried to hurry past. Africa's legacy here isn't about proving superiority or correcting belief. It's about remembrance, about understanding that the sacred once moved freely across lands, now divided by borders and narratives. That faith, before it was standardized, was vast enough to hold mystery without fear. Many chapters still sleep, beneath monasteries, inside languages few can read, within rituals practiced without explanation. And maybe that's intentional. Not all knowledge is meant to be consumed at once. Some truths wait for the right moment, the right ears, the right humility. If something stirred while listening, let it sit with you. Let it challenge the timelines you were given, the origins you were taught to accept without question. Because the past isn't finished speaking, and Africa is still one of its clearest voices. If you feel called to keep walking this path of forgotten histories and ancestral revelations, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay close. Many mysteries remain, resting quietly beneath the sand of time, waiting to be remembered again.